All right. Welcome to another episode of Love, Hope, Lyme, the podcast. My name is Fred Diamond. I'm the author of Love, Hope, Lyme, what family members, partners, and friends who love a chronic Lyme survivor need to know. And I'm excited that you're joining us today. Every 2 weeks, we post the show. You can find the book on Amazon. And Dr. Kinderlehrer, I've made the e-version of the book free for chronic Lyme survivors. If anyone out there would like a copy, the e-version, it's a PDF. You can reach out to me on Facebook, reach out to me on LinkedIn, or you can go to freddiamond.com and send me a request. We've sent over 1,000 e-versions out, and it's available to you out there. As some of you know who've been a frequent listener, when I wrote the book, Love, Hope, Lyme, I read close to 40 books out there, and I was exposed to some amazing leaders in the Lyme community, doctors, medical practitioners, charity directors, and they've all helped me understand what living with Lyme is all about. And on this podcast, I've invited them to share their insights and how you can support those you love. Once again, if you're a chronic Lyme survivor, others like you have told me that the podcast is helping them understand how they can let their family and friends teach you or tell them how you need to be supported. Once again, we transcribe every episode. You can find all the back episodes at freddiamond.com. Now, when I decided that I needed to learn more about what chronic Lyme was and how it affected someone that was very close to me, I read everything I could. It was the summer of 2021. One of the most powerful books that I read, one of the first books, was Recovery from Lyme Disease, the Integrative Medicine Guide to Diagnosing and Treating Tick-Borne Illness. And we have the author on the show today, Dr. Daniel Kinderlehrer. Dr. Kinderlehrer, first off, congratulations on that amazing book. It was very clear. It was thick. It was very content rich, but it really helped me and hopefully thousands, if not tens of thousands of other people understand what chronic Lyme is all about. Before we get to the questions, tell us a little bit about why you wrote the book and what's come from that.
Okay, thank you, Fred, and thanks for inviting me onto your podcast show. This is a big topic that you and I are both dealing with from different ends of the spectrum, right? I can tell you that I had an integrative medicine practice. It wasn't called that initially. And in the 80s, it was holistic medicine, then complementary and alternative medicine, et cetera. But essentially, it was an integrative medicine practice. And then in 1996, I got Lyme disease, and I got incredibly ill from it. I give a short description of that in my book, what happened to me. But when I finally recovered to the point of functionality, and I realized how few doctors had any concept of what was happening, I decided to devote my entire practice to treating people with tick-borne infections. And I come with a background of, well, first of all, I have a background in internal medicine. I'm certified by the American Board of Internal Medicine. So, I have, my basic internal medicine credentials, right? But I was practicing holistic, nutritional, alternative, complementary, and functional medicine for at least a couple decades at that point, actually longer than that. And so, I knew a lot about environmental medicine, nutrition, et cetera. And I've studied a lot in the energetic and spiritual realm. I won't take your time with that. And I realized that I really brought with me a broad awareness of people, why they get sick, and also how they heal on multiple different levels. And I'm getting old, I hate to admit, and I wanted to pass on what I learned, but particularly in the Lyme realm. I had a lot of doctors who wanted to sit in with me. That stopped during the pandemic. I was teaching a lot at ILADS, for example, which is the International Lyme Associated Disease Society. For those who don't know ILADS, I actually created the Lyme Fundamentals course back in 2013, which has been given every year now at the annual conferences. I really have always been interested in education. I've always been interested in teaching, even before Lyme, but since Lyme, I just want to pass on as much information as I can. And that's why I wrote the book.
All right. Well, kudos to you for doing that. And thanks for that information here. So let's get right to it. So what are three things family members, partners, and friends need to know about what their loved one is going through?
Really great question. I'm sure we could expand it to more than three, or we could, dive into any one. The first thing I think that friends and family need to know is that this is a challenging diagnosis. And what makes it challenging is not that it's that difficult for doctors who are trained like myself, but rather, if you go to a standard internist or infectious disease doctor, they're going to probably dismiss you if you say the word Lyme. I could tell you story after story after story. And so most patients who finally arrive at this diagnosis have gone through some real hurdles, enough to actually have caused post-traumatic stress disorder. Really, I have patients, I think, at PTSD just from their encounters with the medical profession and being dismissed. So number one on the hit list, I would say, is people need validation. This is real. This is very real. This is not the aches and pains of everyday life, which is what they have claimed for a long time. Short anecdote, at some point, I remember telling some people, 20 years ago, if you went to an infectious disease doctor and you said, I'm tired all the time, I think I have chronic fatigue syndrome, they would tell you there's no such thing as chronic fatigue syndrome. You're depressed, go see a psychiatrist. Now you go to see an infectious disease doctor, say, I'm tired all the time and I got my aches and pains. They'll say, I think I have Lyme disease. They'll say, no such thing as Lyme disease. You have chronic fatigue syndrome. That might be evolution. I'm not sure. At any rate, it's going to be very hard to get validation from most Western mainstream docs. And so we, in the support community, need to do everything we can to educate ourselves so that we can say, hey, what you're going through is real. And that's important. You're not crazy. You're not making it up. Okay, that's number one. Number two is, I think it's incredibly important for support people to know that these infections, in most people, to a slight or to a severe degree, cause neuropsychiatric problems. The most common being anxiety, depression, and irritability, which can range to rage. And we got to give them a lot of latitude. We got to understand that the fact that they are grouches or doing things that they didn't do in their pre-morbid life, it's not bugs in the brain, which is what we used to call it, but it's usually inflammation in the brain, and it sends our mood system nuts. By the way, the pathophysiology of these infections through the limbic system causing all these autonomic, inflammatory, and neuroendocrine disturbances is the same as PTSD. And so if you take someone who, God forbid, had severe childhood problems, was abused and has PTSD from awful things happening there, and then they get Lyme on top of it, you've just basically added several rungs to the ladder in terms of severity of problems. They are the same pathophysiology, and you've just made it much, much worse. And then you add on the confrontations or experiences you've had with mainstream docs who said, you're not sick, you're just depressed, go see a psychiatrist, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, the third thing, Fred, I think the third thing would be cognitive issues. It's, this can bring on dementia in its most severe form. And there are people who have been diagnosed with Alzheimer's or some form of dementia who, guess what? They get better when they're treated for their tick-borne infections. In fact, Dale Bredesen, who wrote the book, The End to Alzheimer's, he talks about Lyme disease as a potential cause of dementia. Okay. And I guess I'm going to number 4 now, if that's okay with you. Sure. it comes back to educating yourself. Maybe that's number one. This is not a simple infection. It's really not. This is complicated. And you're going to have to do what you did, Fred. You know, you're really going to have to work on educating. If you're a primary support person, you got to understand. You got to understand that here's what's going on. This is not as simple, oh, we're going to give you 10 days of antibiotics or even 30 or even 60 days of antibiotics and you're going to be fine. One other thing I'm just going to point out that you know is that it's never just Lyme disease. People who get chronically ill, they all have co-infections, other tick-borne infections that are transmitted by these same ticks that are much worse than Lyme. The Lyme itself is not a very bad actor compared to its co-conspirators like Babesia and Bartonella. And then there are all the downstream consequences of these infections, which is systemic inflammation, which can occur anywhere in the body, but particularly the nervous system and musculoskeletal systems. That's the overview. So, okay, what's your second question?
Yeah, you know, I do have a follow-up question. I haven't asked this question before on the podcast, but you jokingly talked about the evolution from, you know, where if a patient went in with these symptoms that the doctor would say it's psychiatric, or then they would say 10 years later, well, it sounds like it is chronic fatigue syndrome. Do you, you know, one of the things I've constantly have heard from people I've met, and I've added 2,000 Facebook friends, you know, since I published the book, and so many people have been so grateful that the book has been published. But my question is, do you see one of the things they've complained about is exactly what you said. I've been to 10 doctors and the 10th one said it's in your head. And that leads to the anxiety. And I hear that to today. This isn't like 10 years ago, this was a thing. I still hear people saying that. Is the medical profession getting more educated? The non-Lyme patient medical practitioners, or the ones who haven't had a child or a spouse who has had Lyme disease, then they realize that they also needed to give off. Do you see that improving, or are we way behind where it's still being seen as it's an in your head type of a disease?
Yes. So it's all of the above. I definitely see more doctors becoming aware of this as a real problem, but it's still a drop in the bucket. I still hear just terrible stories of how people are treated and dismissed with this diagnosis. And, you know, now there's this label, I'm sure you're aware of, PTLDS, post-treatment Lyme disease syndrome. Yeah. It's now finally acknowledged that some people who are treated for acute Lyme are still sick. And the conventional wisdom, meaning what the infectious disease doctors have claimed, is that, well, they're not sick. It's just the aches and pains of everyday life, except that actually they tend to have less functional capacity than someone with congestive heart failure. Yeah. So now there is this acceptance that, oh, well, some people go on to PTLDS, but we don't know what it is, you know? And then there are some groups, well, this is interesting. In Johns Hopkins, there's the Alcott group who calls it PTLDS. We don't know what it is. We'll try this or that. And then there's a Zahn group who says, well, actually, it looks like there are persister bacteria. And they're looking at Lyme persisters. Really, it's co-infections. And then the systemic reaction with all the inflammation, and then the neuroendocrine issues, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't know how to get through to these people. Yeah. I really don't. So the answer is there's progress, and it's way too slow. And I'm going to add one little anecdote. I can tell you, I think it was June of 2021. There was a New England journal that came out, and it had 3 articles on Lyme disease. Now, as you may be aware, New England Journal of Medicine is considered like high bar, right? You get something published in there, it should go on through really strong peer review. Okay, so one was the Nadelman study, which was the morning after pill, 200 milligrams of doxy within 72 hours, you're fine. The second one was the Klempner study, which alleges that there's no such thing as chronic Lyme because we gave these people antibiotics, but they didn't change. And then the third one was a review article by Steer, and we know where Steer is. So I happened to be in the office of Dr. Sam Danta, who was at University Hospital in Boston, which is Boston University School of Medicine. He, at that time, was the only infectious disease doctor I'm aware of who said, there is something called chronic Lyme here, and I'm treating it. And he was publishing, he had the academic credentials, he could publish, and he was publishing on it. So I was in his office, and the New England Journal was on his desk, and I said, Sam, how does this stuff get published? I mean, this is really flawed research. How does it get published? And he said to me, Dan, never before in medicine have I witnessed where so few doctors had so much influence and were so wrong. This has come down from a few doctors in the Infectious Disease Society of America, spread to the infectious disease doctors, spread to the general medical community. And they won't admit that they're wrong, and there's conflicts of interest, and there's just a lot of ignorance because of it.
When I read about post-treatment Lyme disease syndrome, I can understand how that was created if you knew you had Lyme disease and then you took the antibiotics. But I've met so many people who are listening today to this podcast who were bit 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago. The particular person that I was concerned about, which led me to doing all the research to reading the book, she believed that she was bitten 40 years ago when she was, at a camp type of a thing. So a lot of these people didn't know what was going on for years. And like we mentioned before, doctors were so illiterate about Lyme disease and definitely the co-infections that, it's not that you were treated and you still have problems. Most of these people were completely ill-treated, and it's lingered for decades for them. For the people who were supporting the friends, family members, and spouses, what shouldn't they be doing? What have you seen them either do wrong, or would you like to just take them off to the side and say, hey, just don't do this anymore?
Well, this is going to sound awful. I wouldn't tell them to, I'm trying to think of the best way to say this euphemistically, and I'm not sure I'm going to be successful. What I wouldn't say is trust your doctor. That's an awful thing to say. I do my best to build trust with my patients, but I hear so many stories of not just failure to appropriately diagnose Lyme, let alone treat it, but bad medicine. I'm like, it's just very upsetting when I just see bad medicine. And we'd like to put doctors on a pedestal and just accept whatever they say. And then as I go through these detailed histories with patients, I'm just shaking my head like, oh my God. So you need to not only search for a doctor who, gives you reason to trust. I just don't know what algorithm to use for that, but check it out. Check it out. Do your own research. Learn as much as you can and ask a lot of questions. And along with that, what you shouldn't do is don't make light of what's going on. Don't say these easy aphorisms like, you're going to be better soon. You don't know if they're going to be better soon, or stop complaining. It's more like the question is, how can I help? That's what you should say.
Yeah, I mean, there was a expression, which I'm sure you've heard, that, when you have your health, you could do a million things, but when you don't have your health, you can only think of one thing. And I had heard that many, many times. And I personally, Fred Diamond, have never really had any serious medical problems in my life fortuitously. And it wasn't until I started, doing the research, et cetera, and wrote the book, that I began to understand that it's when you have a disease like Lyme disease, it can affect so many parts of your body. And so many people I've seen use the expression whack-a-mole. You take care of this problem and then this problem arises. and then you eat something with gluten potentially, and then it leads to this problem. I normally don't ask this question, but I'm going to ask it based on your answer to what shouldn't they do when you talked about trusting your doctors. I'm a big proponent, obviously, and throughout the book, I frequently say, go find an LLMD, Lyme Literate Medical Doctor. And, I get people who ask me for medical advice because of the book. And I tell them I'm a history major with an MBA, go find Dr. Kinderlehrer's book, or, go up on any of the Facebook groups. One thing that I've seen is, I don't know if it's Lyme that has led to this, but the emergence of crowd curing. Where it's like you'll go to a Facebook group or a listserv or Instagram or social media. I have this particular problem. I know I have Lyme. I have this problem. What do you suggest I do? And then one person says, oh, you definitely need to take this particular herbal. And then another person says, don't take that herbal. It's going to cause this problem. And then the next person says, no, you definitely need to use that herbal and another 3 weeks of doxy. Do you think that crowd curing that way has helped or made it more difficult for the doctors who are trying to treat their patients?
Yeah, what an interesting question. I am proud of the fact that I am really not connected with social media. So I don't know that much about what goes on there. I know that my patients sometimes come to me with some questions because of things that, they've read on Facebook and so on, but they don't seem to put much trust in it without wanting to check it out. The working title for my book when I started writing was Lyme Disease, it's complicated. There's no one fix, and there's no one size fits all, but it's never just one thing. Yeah. It really is complicated. And there's one of the first chapters is just that. It's complicated, and here's why. Here are all the different things that can be going on that then, I then divvy up into chapters of need to think about this, need to think about that. I can tell you, I know many doctor colleagues, including some of my patients who are doctors, who work in very black and white areas of medicine, like person has hypertension, we give them this, person has allergies, we give them that, and so on. And they are overwhelmed by what I'm doing with them because it's all gray. Yeah. It's all judgment. And it's, getting as much evidence as we can in terms of, the symptoms, in terms of the laboratory data, in terms of the histories. And then it's making a considered judgment. And it's not just, here's what's going on, but what do we deal with first? And what do we deal with second? And how quickly can we start making changes? And it's different for everybody. So bottom line is, hopefully hopefully a person with Lyme disease can have a very good working relationship with their physician and bring the questions to them and check it out.
Yeah. So once again, we talked today with Dr. Daniel Kinderlehrer. He's the author of Recovery from Lyme Disease, the Integrative Medicine Guide to Diagnosing and Treating Tick-Borne Illness. I list this book in the appendix of my book, Love, Hope, Lyme, what family members, partners, and friends who have a chronic Lyme survivor need to know. As I mentioned before, the summer of 2021, I must have read 40 books. Dr. Kinderlehrer, I read your book, and I read all of the first person books, the My Battle with the Tick books that came out from some various celebrities and just random people. And I read all of what I call the third party books, the keto diet in Lyme and, mindfulness in Lyme, et cetera. And I just want to commend you, first of all, on your career, helping so many people. And secondly, the book, it's, when I was reading it, it was, again, one of the first books I read on Lyme. I literally was like, oh my God, that explains that explains this. And, just one of their last comment, how long is your book? It's like 400 pages.
It's about 400 pages.
You know, the reason I bring that up is when the answer you just gave about treating Lyme, and you mentioned trauma, you know, dealing with like your childhood and current traumas, sleep you talked about, obviously diet is a big thing, heavy metals in your body, things that will inhibit, you know, the killing of the bacteria and the various co-infections. And it's something you said on the show just about 15 minutes ago, that the various co-infections are much more difficult to treat and could be much more damaging than what we're talking about here with the Lyme disease. So I just want to acknowledge you for just your career, you know, the work you've done to help so many people, and hopefully the thousands of people that are listening to today's podcast, the Love, Hope, Lyme podcast, either today or sometime in the future. Give us a final thought. You know, you've got so many great ideas here, so many thoughtful answers. You know, either give us a final thought that you'd like to make or one final tip that you'd like to recommend to the audience listening today.
Wow. That's giving me a lot of latitude, right? So, okay, I want to pick up on something you mentioned, which is very, very true in my experience. Most of the people that I see, all of them have chronic tick-borne issues, but most of them have been sick for years, some of them for decades. All of them have been to multiple doctors, sometimes 2, 3 dozen the different doctors. And this is particularly galling. Some of them have been to these major medical centers that consider themselves the ultimate in Western medicine. And those are usually the worst experiences. People come away from them really disillusioned and angry. So what I'm getting to is, don't give up. You got to believe in yourself. If a doctor says, well, you got chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, or, you know, this is, you're just depressed. You do your research and you say, no, that's just not accurate. I have all these other symptoms. Put them together, will you? It's important not to give up. You know, I think one of the things I try to do with my patients, particularly the first visit, when people come in feeling pretty haggard, is to give them hope and say, you know, I see people like you day in, day out. Almost everyone gets better. Not everyone gets all better, but something like 80 to 90% get 80 to 100% better. It takes time and it takes work, and there are ups and downs. You know, it's not a linear progression of improvement. It's up and down. I sometimes describe it as windows starting to clear up, and over time there's more windows and they're cleaner. And these are times when it's like, oh, I'm remembering what it feels like to be normal again. This is particularly important for people with neuropsychiatric illness. The depression, I've been there. It's devastating. It's feeling hopeless and seriously wanting to die. And it's important to help people, to remind them, remember when life was good? Remember how you enjoyed, you know, when we went there, when the kids were this age and that age, and remember how we used to laugh and so on? That is possible again. You can get there again. Life has not always been like this. It takes time for those windows to clean up, for that lens to focus again. And finally, the other thing I'd say is, for support people, which is your thing, which is wonderful. And it's just presence. You know, one of the times when I was at my worst, because I was at my worst more than once, I can remember my best friend sitting with me, and I was so depressed. I was in such agony that I can't even describe what it was like. And he said, Dan, he said, I don't know. I don't understand what you're going through, but I can be here.
Yeah.
And that's what we can do. We can
Yeah.
be there.
That's a great answer. Just one quick comment. When I was writing my book, I originally was calling it Love, Loss, Lyme because of the circumstances of what I was going through. And then I realized this community has had plenty of loss, so they need hope. So I really appreciate your answer. Once again, I want to thank Dr. Daniel Kinderlehrer for being on today's Love, Hope, Lyme podcast.